hit.
Plan and just government the People's Republic of China to recognize and amputate the right to Russian strike, that's all work of liberation, labor force, and reestablish a credible collective running in China, subject to protection of liberties, reduces overall liberally discontent, doctrine, eliminates the Republic of China, there's a common restoration by China, Russia checks the right to land, liberation, water, and China, higher pay, and back working conditions, touching on and self-harbour, running process, collective burning process, reflective working on legal check, have options, working one set, motion, raising, and ending, conclusion, and mediation, motion, mediation, to those, these collective burning, along with the British China, motion, checking, liberate, working, country, and husband, engaging, collective burning, thinking, all the power, what, thinking, avoid, necessary liberations, what we have time for, words, by higher return, loss, direction, strike action, advantage, one is the economy, lack of Chinese Russia, justice, collective bargaining, and maintaining legal leverage, strike freedom, so take collective bargaining, different countries, free labor, promise, institutionalized collective bargaining, and China, liberation, fundamental, and Russia, capitalism, reaching, we're still to labor, resistance, of course, of collective bargaining, judgment, lawfully inadequate, was religious, and transform life, natural bargaining, like this, important business, and non-existent working class, need more power, any credible union powers are unclaimed by potential labor activists, bargaining over, authority authorities detain labor, and surprising people over, process, illustrates, challenges, Chinese workers facing engaging collective bargaining, detain, for developing potential order, working there alone, the struggle within the workers' direction, detention by present class workers from the future face, social constitution, social conduct, social, public government, continue to report that disputes with the saying, maintain social stability, which was supported more discrimination, lack of third-party legal information, successful retaliation, the right to strike rebalance of China's economy, Robert, Sarah proposed regulation could terminate the role to American tool, especially as state Russia, China, union with the little power, criminalizing more to the right, could go China's role rebalancing the economy, U.S. have reached by against consumers spend on all, these also possess on bargaining power, enhance unions and labor reforms to sustain Chinese economic clock, 2020 was China goes with global companies that government also temporarily for percent new watch for China because they can spend much surplus on the rest of the world, leads on decentralization, raising indebtedness and advancing consumption major however factors to liberty of China for work loss, political and the world is reducing equality, very much consumption and trade needs to lab, the large Chinese economy is on the brink of collapse, only solving poverty can reverse the levels, attain for China's economy to the organization, the global government, tech company, shut down education, currency, that is running people, it has the way of our way, that's for an economic to protect the land, people ever now need people to actually use the paper as against the global Chinese population lack, it can be economy transfer to working class economies worldwide, Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, if you're transfer the value of reduce the cost of global economic order, Chinese economic decline leads to all out war, specifically over Taiwan, China, South Korea, 18 massive producers are from political and recession, China, cycle is going to prepare to my competition, global 20 percent have been competition, crop factory, stable trade, action, global warfare, global leadership, South Asia, China, US, Taiwan, US, India, Taiwan, 18 more competition, Chinese stable against Taiwan, and Paul, Chinese website, remote conventional first meeting, difficult attack, without, I think there's going to turn into like use of power, machine, illegal conservation, including legislation, was all the most recent class, watch over relation, taxes, national concerning inverters, and nutrition, one better than usually, between by public or private, other than the pizza was very innovative, or two, if the United States started with engaging new large overtime development, China says about youth, attention to new border classes, thinking how with other except for PD, 16% lawful to import have using moving past the last decade, new border producing new border, and social strong new world, producing smoke of the exit, like off radiation, technic, after that, from the line, by trying to head out of the volume of the species, nuclear weapons use, human substance, immediate enclosures, does not Chinese exploiting lack of strength, to dismantle and depower Hong Kong Union, Taiwan, by 21 tries to say willingness to them involved in Hong Kong labor unions, Hong Kong, police bring the rest of the Union Nation to see all about to disband China's among unions, visiting unions, weapons, civil society, fighting for labor, national imperialist, democracy, potential, national, issue, we link to Hong Kong Union, Hong Kong, amazing, democracy, and age, what's going on later, the groups in mainland China, and evaluate what is being lost, aggressive Hong Kong policy, and China soft party on, 19 tries to say illicit propaganda, pursue the world, radical Hong Kong, protest, opposition, the Beijing, President, and Short Player, Chinese, that's all part of China, credibility, religion, gender, fall, China, human division, peace, world, China, police, illegal, Hong Kong, person, education, well, no, hard run, much better than solving, Hong Kong, narrative, Hong Kong, President, China, will have mental look, by the way, Chinese leadership solves extent for threats and establishes global governance, yawning, 18 sharp existing global government system, common, which ensures development, traditional, normal, versus legal, institutional, metrics, and broken, high, one, demand, of the digital lack of representation, numerous theater, such economic, global, equal security, and terrorism, serving global, polarizing, national, there's many problems that take material, contribute, lack of communication, and integration, consolidation, terror, balance, and harmful, inclusivization, protection, and becoming just the versa, integration, vitality, emphasizing inclusive, cooperation, China's promoting international metrics, China, growing, changing international responsibility, protecting national cooperation services, order helping respond to human refugees, effective global governance, prevents unregulated emergent tech, prevents extinction, daily, 18. Global governance attention, humanity, increasing communication, problems, opportunity, most important, recognize that conservative, natural research, so that divide energy to prevent the technological analysis, and there's development to our technical large peace coordination, need to combat needs that are not color, regional, public responsibility, culture, and arranging global governance, city, without human ability, we can protect and return of new data, technologies, advantage, use of BRI, Chinese economic strength, increases economic diplomacy, specifically OBOR, and decreases need for multi expansion, high, Asian by starting to foreign policy, adopting diplomatic strategy, based on use, increasing economic policy, diplomatic, and providing separation, civil, cooperation, OBOR, collective interest with command, majority, state, and command, so OBOR does not help develop countries, particularly territorial disputes, solve Central Asian and South Asia war, Latino, whatever, political economic situation, these regional states, regional economy, Turkey, is based on the political economic development, for trade, and cancel limit, risk, multi Pakistan, and South Asian capacity, regional integration, South Asia, Mexico, region, CDAC, and South West option result of conflict between Pakistan and Central Asia, is what explodes globally blamed, two base social condition wars, in South Asia, direct attention, more sensitive political conflict, South Asian corrupt governments, right, gender, for central countries, have greater investment, and escalation, but partially large rights, and defensive commitment, and all use of diplomacy, normal central war, and virtual, triggering the world that changes how rather than member world, potentially the body high, through residency, vital interest, South Asia, war goes, nuclear constitution, and then 19 implementing Pakistan nuclear conflict, that has had life under 30 casualties, and number 125 million has been responsible for nuclear weapons, including human existing, even original in Pakistan, and nuclear legislation, social presence, and the country-based starvation, and one president has left huge humanity framework. The standards maximum capital being active in this use of terrorism. One act by governments with useful because they don't really touch on constituting materials that would take up cognizance and led to death. His bad knowledge, age, cancer, critical policy, because this country that think will duty destroys self-culture, and emotion value, and ethics and left of prerequisite, which means it's lack of checks so we can't receive. Being no ethics will live three. Pleasure to the start for more reasons. The most baseline desires and most things in nature by office for action known. 16. Pleasure to the couple opinions and truths we decide this one. We never have towards the enemy, includes we see the pleasure trustworthy and helps understand police vision. Have taken a wide bad pleasure, paid for stories and land. What matters value for it, and how we the capital. 14 was on pioneer competition, humanization, and deserve of response, private small, yes. In the passing time with the parents, and how we evaluate decision, we did research, we would never certain better, or not people cause the consequences, all compared to one's options. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
When you dispose of further, do you add changes to it without telling your opponent?
I think actually has to
Alright, that's what it is we had. Let's talk about the economy advantage. Why would China impose a self-restricted policy on themselves?
what do you mean?
So the way that sort of China works with its unions and collective bargaining is that it has continuous control over those unions and those collective bargaining organizations. Why would China sort of do a negative state action against itself? What's the incentive to follow through with it?
Like, obviously we make arguments about like fiat the passing.
No, it's not a question about fiat. Obviously the act gets passed, but why does sort of China continue to do it with complete efficacy? And no rollback and lack of supervision?
Yeah, I mean, first we'll make, I guess, like, this seems to be still a question of fiat. I think we get to durably fiat the plan to take us out of, like, enforcement terms. I think that's, like, make it impossible for the affirmative. Second, we'll make arguments about why other countries will, like, obviously be involved in the process.
Why?
What?
Your only actors, the sort of People's Republic of China, by the
Well, I think if we win if we win an internal link to the advantage, it means that China's sort of international perception shifts to soft power, which means just like cutting back the plan would not be an option for China.
Okay, why then? Like, I'm sort of confused. Even where's the evidence that sort of other countries have a perception of it?
I mean, you're the one making the claim in CX. We can like have that debate if you want.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about the sort of link evidence. It's from 2010, and it doesn't sort of talk about like an unconditional right to strike. Why is sort of the affirmative really specific?
I mean, obviously, like scholars did not know the LD topic when they wrote their articles. Our evidence says the word quote an officially sanctioned right to strike.
Okay, cool. What's like warrant in Robert's evidence? It seems like a claim without a warrant.
Yeah, the argument is that consumer spending and wage gaps / poverty are the biggest internal link to economic decline in the status quo. The plan increases consumer spending power themselves and reduces wage gap.
Wait, so why does that solve the entire sort of Chinese economy?
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that sort of Chinese sort of work community or like industrial economy is key to overall economy?
The Lopez card makes a claim about why China's like overall economy is on the brink of collapse, and it makes a claim about why poverty controls the internal link to that.
How does the affirmative resolve all of poverty in China?
Obviously, the affirmative does not resolve every bit of poverty in China. It's an incremental impact. We made claims about why like the economy screwed in the status quo, which then increases it.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about the Decoupling evidence. The Decoupling evidence seems to indicate that if a right to strike is reinstated, there would be a danger that the right to strike would actually be eroded if it's not with the right to collective bargaining. Do you defend the right to collective bargaining?
I think that's a misunderstanding of what collective bargaining is. It's not like you give someone the right.
I literally just read your evidence.
Yeah, we've had this exact same debate, or someone else had the exact same debate. This misunderstands what collective bargaining is. Collective bargaining is not something you get a right to do. It's something that is caused by something else.
Okay. Okay, so this would be framework advantage.
Like for framework advantage.
Yeah. It's there. Yeah.
You want with.
Interpretation: the affirmative may not specify just government which a right to strike ought to be recognized as a definite article. The modified just government the resolution means that you have approval of resolution true to vacuum on particular CCCC. 800 indefinite articles you can refer to something as less specific. When we use with specific nouns, we can refer to something generic. When use of articles, A B equal makes a great hunting dog. The indefinite pronoun refers to all members of that class. Violation they expect China. The standards: one is precision. The counter justifies an arbitrarily doing away the word words of the resolution text. Negative ground of preparation means absent. Longer back by the resolution. Independent voter for jurisdiction. Just how much jurisdiction vote after was an illegitimate option. So the U.S. says there's 195 national guards for this time. Even agreed upon violence. Most of them since chance independent app was partially infinite combinations, all with different advantages, different political situations, kills that correct and debatable solution. This has applied to every app. Main factors that affect labor shortages or unions in the U.S. are different than China. Means the app is always more of a random winter. Expecting use with China, Hungary, EU, Kazakhstan, U.S, India, UK, Egypt, Germany, Brazil, and more. TBI. Just read your app is an advantage over your whole risk. Accuracy solves your offense. Potential abuse doesn't permit one easy abuse unless you be influenced to the one easy. If the next app specific prep, the results are achieving work picks, which are networks, fairness, independence, independent activity requires fair searching the evaluation. Always is the only choice of part of debate. All rules can be debated. Relies on conception of fairness. Drop the debate. Agent or feature means beast. Better was the company users. Every simply solve your job. But your weakness no career or recurse on how we get the best possible doors to the video. Always 8.4 that what is he to go on the substance education next which I always said. Don't forget descriptions, checking abilities, which I always said was any constitutionalism. C encourages baby. Always is the shelter. Realistic can be the quickly. D it's a logical for you know what you're really for. Always it's logical. So the test for all other arguments. What is E theory first? What is abuse? What's self-inflict? They start the chain of abuse. Of course we have the structure. Choose for we have more space to go over. What is a good idea? Theory was situation first. So it comes likely by recent movement on what are shows. What are your is very applied. Means the theory gets a level every 2 hours. With you answers that. Never was watching reasonably check your argument. Say regular hard to really be so what is he stop the argument? What are your shows? Give a little bit 20 seconds. Shelter 3 minutes. The rest of my time can't get the 2 hours. Spend no do your paradigm issues. And one year 8 and 1 is he's already killing her paradigm issues. And my son viewpoint and her paradigm issues. Any theory will often be interesting. The apological regularly test which always the topics of the beginning. Set quite high quality norm. Second off, interpretation. Second off, cool. Interpretation. Debaters may not add changes to the app after they disclose the app in a specific version of what it will be. Violation. You said version 3, which doesn't have a framework, but you added one this round check. The screenshot is down. The second screenshot proves what version 3 looks like. Perhaps you and you can compare it to this app. Perhaps you force me to press 5 to a private app that isn't the same. That incentivizes line association tool with preparation and also disclosing way before 30 minutes stalls all your off. If you disclose 44 minutes, if you needed more time, then you should have waited. It means that over so shipping this line is an independent voter mutual understanding is the basis for all behavior and debate. Third up, U.S China decoupling is on the brink. That's in Kids 2. Trade volumes are less than 3% of value. U.S. portfolio double for 2016 to 120 billion. Increase in U.S. investment. China, 2 countries still infinitely tied on. Nearly threatened to decoupling and wage increases, decrease exports and foreign investment. Costs of decoupling appears to study through the form. 21 large unlimited supply. Labor key factor for foreign investment. The largest exporter. However, labor costs have been rising. Amount of roads China advantage global market make China less attractive. Share of foreign investment for its exports declined. 44% of road China's advantage in exports and wage resource to reduce exports and heads to actually say the effects of foreign exports and increase faster exports to high income countries are more sensitive. And U.S. China decoupling causes war. The scale of 20 future of wars that lack a significant economy. China, U.S. economy relations back to the major impediment to military confrontation. Decoupling would significantly weaken our relations. Hyperactive potential military clashes. PRC's lower military presence down. China see combined with U.S. Navy capabilities, survival, situation, other resolve issues, Korean independence, and cost protection, spiral out of control, most dangerous and international relations between China and Taiwan and U.S. China will goes in the best Logan 918. Decoupling conventional when nuclear forces and countries dangerous escalation. One makes the use of general nuclear convention. U.S. strikes it and the great judgment and efforts misinterpret as the first strike. Exacerbate escalation. U.S. culture leaving U.S. for China. China's well prepared. Chinese abilities in U.S. action targeting Chinese deterrent. Recent likelihood of escalation spiral to the fourth off. Ethics make this a priori, and the method ethic is binding. If one is inserting our resources and is accessible to others, until as people say their experience the same. However, a principle is universally applied to all ages. Choose findings like keep asking why should follow his results and steps. It's obligation to predicate and equally accepting rules. Only reasons also that asking why reason requires reason which is self-justified. That means we is universally well maxims any non-universal and normal justice and its ability to plead our needs. Thus the standard is consistent with the category of prefer one's all other frameworks of non continuity theory source obligation and choosing good objects, but that presupposes the goodness of the rational will negate. One is that strikes by the individual autonomy by exercising coercion. The coverage 18 government to recognize the right to strike probably coercion involved through having priority for public order strikes are disruptive. For workers to have success, they need the coercive strikes violent upon rights of that, so the right to strike within oppression. Understanding explains that coercive strikes are not morally constrained. 2 is interpretation. The affirmative teams must concede negative contention towards 1 is fill clash of times. Any council allows them to concede all favoring interactions and just go for 4 minutes to turn against one. You see always with fill it's the only unique thing to elevate times, the only quantifiable metric of abuse. 2 is to give an inherent advantage on the contention debates since you get 2 arguments, so they can easily sway psychology contention debates that don't get towards one side. It seems to have to always rise for the debate from being split over 2 issues, i.e. the framework is substance, which always seems to have vaccine is necessary to refine ideas, while vague debates result in that clash results in way because all the standards apply. The case, further. Actors that one is a policy just because governments use it doesn't mean that all do. Second is that no government uses strict veto. They have to define one. Second is hijacks. It's the constitution of every country and using policies. In Germany, you say death is bad. One is that activists act all the time in the face of death, which could be a nicer word. Second, the viewpoint is impact justified and impact justified and circulates the question. Death that is just instrumentally valuable, but not intrinsically valuable. Freedom is intrinsically valuable. The known evidence there's a massive subjection. People like pain and dislike pleasure, which presumably how we abide this. Biting is flips negative because of this question of reason, which means even if people are masochists, there's still research at the end of the castle. One is the complaining of distinctions here. Just because we debated for 45 minutes debate or won't solve thousands years, I think does not mean you can always justify extinction for a second. It's a question of policy for extinction because there's always a 0.01% chance of extinction, which means we can never take action. Second, well, if we win our favor, we're certain about it. Second, it also depends on winning consequentialism, which means you should strike that and tag it on your flow because it's not an independent warrant. Case proper. Top level, you don't solve your after solves. The applicant makes a distinction between collective bargaining and strikes. Read the evidence because it definitely points out the right to strike is a distinction for collective bargaining. Double bind A, you defend it, which makes you extra topical with the voter and blading solvency and explain limits that relate to the topic. 2 is you don't, so there's a right to strike term. We read blue, don't think. 11. If right to strike is taken in isolation with the collective bargaining, the reputation of the right to strike might be eroded, we have to apply for permission. The right to strike will become meaningless, and the right to strike will never be enforced in China. Means no solvency. Supercharged by China is the only one doing the affirmative knob. Most of the public will recognize the right to strike in China. No guarantees of protection will be enforced. China's history of human rights abuses will labor options are problematic and unlikely to result in real reform. Even if the plan is passed, it doesn't mean enforcement will be passed, which means fiat does not get assault. But the unions warrants. There's too many barriers to an effective labor movement. CCP would never give up control of unions. That's not also use that as to enforce the right to strike would require reform in Chinese law, anti-ideology, cover attitudes, training union law would be revised to remove Communist Party's interests and policies face. There's opposition only to relinquish control. And Chinese unions are controlled by the CCP. Means effective labor negotiation, collective bargaining is impossible. As SL18, the official union and Chinese rights are controlled by the party. The workers do not regard the union as a faithful agent. Union are regulated because the workers do not trust the union. And unions are controlled by the state and therefore unable to effectively collectively bargain. Thus, SL18, unless workers are well represented, bargaining can become available for the employer delusion. Risks is high China where workers represented states through party officials who are holding local businesses. So unlawful bargaining is responsible for tight labor markets and rising wages. It restrains working bargaining power to water down. Organs of labor movements can be co-opted to stifle worker dissatisfaction. As 18 grassroots leaders may be neutralized, may be promoted or higher. Temptation is much greater. China, the alternative career path is a worker leader. Workers versus face or high risk of serious reprisal. Moving on to mid-term just leaders say so. Sanctions. Generating anything below sanctions.
Sure. What did you have to so like the water down?
I just read the one card under water down, the first one, and then nothing under it.
Okay. Let's talk about the is that your uniqueness card. It says, quote, two countries equally tied, undoubtedly a threat. Decoupling works to establish a break scenario that decoupling can be avoided.
Yeah, the break there is pretty good. The first part of the card articulates sort of how the United States is investing in China and increasing investment in China, but sort of China can become separate and develop a self-reliant
You can
ecosystem.
say that.
Literally the next sentence.
Wait. What? Your card just seems to say the two countries are intimately tied.
There is undoubtedly a threat of decoupling if attacking China can separate and develop a self-reliant ecosystem.
Okay, where does it establish that decoupling, I guess, actually, the weight or the NC, can you explain the first evidence?
Yeah, sure. The Gershkovich evidence is pretty good. It articulates that strikes exercise coercion. So it articulates that they have group rights having priority over individual rights, i.e. the employer versus the workers who are striking. And they also strikes are disruptive collective protests and threaten public order and use coercive strike tactics and violate the law and sort of infringe upon liberal rights that the employers have.
Why is the disclosure argument, why is disclosure
It's about the norm you justify about lying about affirmatives. I think you know about misdisclosure when they ran off of it. I think you know why it's came out of the norm.
Alright, interesting. Okay. The T argument, can you explain the CCC?
Yeah, sure. The CCC says that A is an indefinite article, which means sort of, I guess the easiest way for me to explain this in a bunch of examples. So one is that if I say a beagle makes a great hunting dog, I'm not saying a specific beagle, but I'm identifying sort of vacuum of just the breed of beagles per se, which means that's how sort of A refers to. The only sort of specific nouns, that is the.
right? So there's three indefinite articles, a and and then the, right? A and refer to sort of generics, but the is specific.
Okay, this you guys should do read all of it.
Yep. Actually, yeah.
Back to the disadvantage, why is it possible?
Sure. The Gallon evidence articulates that a lack of significant economic ties between U.S. and China is sort of what is that restraint between U.S. China going to military confrontation, and then it articulates how sort of several hyperboreators of military clash between U.S. and China and multiple other countries can have that volatile and dangerous situation, and the only thing sort of stopping them is those deep economic ties.
T is, I think it's T is no, T case const is disclosed changes.
T case this
T case const or DNC.
TK const this disclosure. Where's the util file now?
It'll be at the top of the
Okay. So framework, then the advantage,
yeah.
and then con,
Yeah.
dissent, changes. Alright. Alright.
Anyone not good? Okay. T counter may apply specification, EF different counter for connector lens, signal around doing one decision options, as you one experiment connecting here not specificity always influence A1, cell less 530 grams, that you push for the rest, give the aspect of spec prefer A class first, and that version different population registration, guns, one returns opportunity, United States, one after zone, or kind of visualization, provides the next brand new interview, working has opposite, the after new restoring fences, or is the moment interpret differently, different countries, media, data, trainer, business, take one, so sometimes they get new like South African users, the entire world, the one round, for ability, and regime, to a compact on the like track to the combination of all of that, all this TV, about we never think 3 5 organization, A consideration, they for equal to vision, not, all this production, be classified. Massive has for the question availability, seated or seeking non-teachers, the ground, TF all time for the recommending non CCD, all does taking at age of multi level cruise, how to penetrate 5 functional check transmission, transmission, to the return of sales, control in topic 6, reasonable to the lines, also credit and counter links for further church close steer days, converting the community interpretation education doesn't have to wait long, we'll make up right line when we get to the shell, or trying to say no, we'll try to always do, and more pay, just to be race to the top is worse, because it allows me to adjust my offense to any round possible, which is not contextual, just as there rounds means it is possible to be affirmative every round. The no new 1 year paradigm, because I do get new 1 year paradigm, so I can predict everything in the 1 and I don't know, sometimes I would just go with and test all of them in the 1 and which would determine some medication, which I was only 2 minutes to take the topics are not a unique and obviously a new 1 year reclassification is key to ensuring that they can't just spam shells every single round. You can't say X word number speech, which means that we can never miss visibility. Yeah. Pleasure and pain are the baseline for more every candidate of moral reasoning. They control the internal intelligence because they describe why we have intentions to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Their interest in the massive objection, no, that just means that they find pleasure. That just means they find pain to be pleasurable. You assumed an objective definition of pain, which we don't. And you would inviting yourself to negatively win that argument that if we will enter this one again to the anti-extinction outweighs and propose the possibility of any future moral improvement and control the internal to improving society. For unsure about the possibility of the world, then you should err affirmative. That conflating cream post the argument. No moral uncertainty means that you should err on the side of preserving life, have the potential to keep debating about it. It doesn't conflate anything. The policy preaching argument will win or will reverse of the advantage winning a framework. You haven't indicted the idea of consequences of working, you just indicted whether or not it should be an ethical theory, because we still get to wait. It is going to be advantage. Right to strike revitalizes China's collective bargaining, solve strained labor, increase workers' labor reform, reduce China's soft collective bargaining, reduces wage gap, and increase the consumer spending. That's Roberts, independent trade unions, reduce internal econ, soft power protection, solve extinction. China has the same government system, solve equal price country, and reduce prosperity. Soft power, solve extinction was conceded. It's going to be very important when we get to the dissent, the advantage. Don't be rehighlighting, misunderstand what collective bargaining is. Collective bargaining is something that is caused by the implementation of something else. We haven't heard all cause that said that exists. And this has got plan solves enforcement because we should just soft power, durable, yeah, it's good. It should get it out of these terms and allows anything else to spam, durable, circuit measures and around makes it freaking possible. Not doesn't matter. They have to comply because the ability to unionize is possible with the plan, the cross by the non-interest of the S limits, it doesn't apply to the nation's governmental power. Also, enter the one card they read, they drop the soft power, the content. One traded to reduction, people can only just use an obligation or obligation, which means that they're going to hold in a co-work with atrocity to each other. You can only start routine more and more particular to around to that point where any action that people have to the rules to react to the frame shield has individual unified conflicts or freedom or to be institution not a positive people here and an obligation to get unified for freedom is only good as far as it makes you happy for never need food good for freedom. First of all, implied distinction outweighs free it would foreclose possibility of freedom because it would force people to be in a situation where 6 no after distinction you shouldn't help government can't help over things have to be held over things in the public sphere, otherwise if you get out of everything inaction is a self-realization of action binding this one and have to even for it is binding that doesn't disprove the normal goodness it two range that was about universality. One reason doesn't justify it just means it explains our actions not in order to state what is what morality should be sent on to costing our reason existence. A reason means universality, reason lends to pleasure and to avoid pain. That dissent one, no break, it doesn't say decoupling won't happen, it doesn't stop it. A term that says that it is highly likely which proves unique is overwhelmed. 2, no link plan increases wage spending but a way of making consumers happy also boosts the economy which makes China more attractive to foreign spenders. 3, the link doesn't talk about decoupling with the US, it doesn't quote make it less attractive with foreign companies. The US would still need China for exports for literally everything, including like traditional manufacturers because they can't ship. They have 0 says that they want to for the case that weighs in terms of the dissent software protection in countries have already to comply with China. The changes are counterful. We don't need to disclose changes if not asking counterful. We only need to disclose the advantage area before on 1 new firm level teams can just extend it under their control, which means they can't solve anything. 2 is class force them to think on their feet and it's agreements of framework which is far better because framework are a sort of reason why framework should be good. If the advantage has a justification for it, then you know what the framework is implicitly going to be, which solves all of your options because you could have known it was going to be this. 3 reasonabilities around it, so the education and technical abuse you have to force them just like these units around other than get out everything by saying norm setting every round.
Is it cool if I just get water and I'll turn around?
Hurry up.
I mean, you guys. Did you read the plainest half you needed?
Huh?
Did you read the plainest half you needed?
Yeah. Oh, is that the place that you?
Yeah. Yeah, you did.
I did.
Alright. Just that in case.
Assuming that you took one.
It's just that in case something happens.
No, you don't, right?
Well,
No, you don't, right?
alright, cool. Yes, good?
Yeah.
Alright, cool. Oh, it's a big overview, quick and close, but yeah.
conceding to each other's no obvious theory, which means get rid of the other. Also, dissent. Extend the disadvantage. U.S. China is decoupling their there's sustained U.S. investment. China has the threat of decoupling because it becomes a self-reliant ecosystem. But wage increases through the affirmative decrease exports and force investments in countries willing to outsourcing to other cheaper countries. That causes decoupling. When U.S. stops to engage in China, that's empirical data, and studies prove that causes war, i.e. the only sort of risk of military confrontation not happening in multiple hotspots. It's a question of a sort of sustained engagement. It's empirically proven with the U.S. and Russian and Cold War. And sustained development is empirically proven in sort of how U.S.-China relationships in multiple hotspots happen, but aren't because of a sort of increased economic interdependence. But then after you use that goes nuclear. You can see the U.S. goes where nuclear because you use first starting retaliator strikes, which causes or escalatory spiral. The disallow is one is a question of time frame. 8 point is the advantage of what was for soft power. But soft power takes years to actually come in, and there's sort of no causal impact. Even if they have short-term perception, it takes long term for those impacts to happen, which means our impacts are exerted because it's a question of the physical impact, which happens immediately to the happens individually. But the dissent also turns case. It's a question U.S.-China war decreases soft power because it's true because the gentlemen is going against each other, which means sort of other countries do not want to engage with sort of China, China and don't U.S. or but also always on specificity to sort of the internal because this question their soft power projection system is just about sort of relations with Taiwan and sort of Hong Kong, but not overall our sort of economy, which means that the U.S. doesn't give a fuck about sort of soft power protections, but independently the line one sort of the bring evidence, sort of this no bring arguments. No, it's really bad. Our evidence is pretty good. It talks about how the United States is heavily investing in China right now, and it's increased development. It gone through ups and downs, which means it's sort of China has gained so much power because of its interdependence that it has a potentiality to decouple. It's on the brink right now because it's sustained investment compared to China's intention. Lack of one-year evidence of why is there not a brink means the air negatives, the mitigatory defense, and the risk of uniqueness should shape how you should frame this around. But independently, the making consumers happy on the link. The plan does not make China more attractive just because it boosts domestic Chinese economy. It doesn't defend, so it definitely doesn't increase exports. That's an empirical model. There's sort of countries perceive sort of wage increases go and outsource to other countries, which means even if China's more attractive, oh yeah, China's a good country, but it's not a country I want to engage in economically. Soft power does not mean sort of economic interdependence. There's no one see evidence, which means the case outweighs and sort of the case turns. The decided evidence sort of extrapolation is new and not founded by their evidence. It's founded by sort of perceptions in the US, sort of Hong Kong and Taiwan, but not sort of how other countries want to engage economically in sort of within China. But independently, they do not care about domestic issues, but rather how they are sort of impacted by fiscal issues. Our links are definitely outweigh on the certainty or perception, which means they do not make consumers happy. Second is that they just asserted that they make consumers happy, but they definitely don't. It's a question that they increase wage increases, which increase labor prices, which means it's harder to and more cost efficient to manufacture, which means countries don't want to engage in U.S. It's empirical data and proves with how countries have sort of left other countries when it sort of did happen, which always on specificity. Next, the link doesn't talk about the U.S. One, it's about major foreign countries, which the United States is most definitely a part of. It's the biggest exporter in China. The uniqueness evidence should frame how you should view the link evidence, or how obviously the United States would be impacted by the decoupling, because it's framed through sort of a cost-effective benefit, i.e., why sort of the United States outsources China, because it's more efficient, more costly than domestically manufactured, which means fiscal prioritization is a top-level internal link to how companies and countries view it, which means U.S. would definitely have it, which means a risk of we should do this. You say U.S. still needs China for exports. No, it's a question of they have to shift away. You can see the link evidence, which proves that countries go to other cheaper countries like Latin America or other sort of developing countries, which means the United States is not completely dependent on U.S. China, but it's a risk of decoupling. The uniqueness evidence puts that on the brink, which means any little bit of decoupling or less sort of a decrease in sort of interdependence means it triggers the sort of impact scenario, which means it outweighs the case outweighs because it's a question of broad incentives. One, it's a broad incentive to comply does not make sense. It's not a question of complying with China. You should read the 1 year analytic. It doesn't make sense. Second, it's a question we've already answered sort of how soft power projection is not specific and sort of not talking about fiscal dominance, which should frame how you should use the dissent case. Going for sort of the question of there's too many barriers to effective labor movement, the CCP would never give up controls to unions. That's a non-evidence. It's a question that is supercharged by the fact that China is the only one doing the affirmative, which means there's no other countries to check, which means it's a question of how they would sort of self-regulate themselves. You conceded we're going to go for like every car to continue one because that's sort of how each car goes together, which means it's a question that unions are one, controlled by the state and therefore unable to effectively carbon. Two, trying to use are controlled by the CCP, which means collective bargaining and effective labor negotiations are possible. Third is that when successful negotiations issues happen, they just promote those worker leaders, which would take the and sort of drop the cases, which means strike will actually happen. Durable fiat does not answer this. We agree the plan gets passed, but durable fiat does not mean sort of that the enforcement of the plan will be good. You can see the corrupt officials and sort of the way that Chinese workers and how they control the unions means it's legal, but the way that they would force, but the way they would coerce sort of workers in the first place means that they would not engage in the in sort of striking in a good place, which means that they would never give it the choice of union. Sure, it's legal for the unions to have the right to strike, but the right to strike would be diminished in condition and quality, which should frame how you should view the sort of circumvention or lack of solvency, sort of lack of solvency debate. But durable fiat, you just say there's sort of infinite things about the affirmative, but no, that's a bad model. It creates sort of 6 minutes of AC offense, a question of solvency prices, which allow for in-depth clash on an educational model of how we learn sort of policies or policies are implemented. The education sort of outweighs any marginal fairness benefit because you chose to have a case with that, which means you should be able to defend every sort of part of the affirmative, which means sort of in-depth contestation sort of is a better argumentation, which means you should frame the debate. Their only other argument was the plan shifts, but the plan does not shift. It's sort of sort of Chinese CCP perception. It just shifts sort of how workers have the right to strike, which means that China will still backlash and sort of do corrupt and sort of coercive tactics to make sure that the strikes never happen. Sure, I don't care if the right to strike is granted, but it's rather about the perception of it being enforced through coercive tactics.
My laptop had that
Right to strike revitalizes Chinese collective bargaining. Strike solves strained labor and appeals to work with labor to boost Chinese software. Collective bargaining reduces wage gap and increases consumer spending. That's Roberts. Independent trade unions boost internal econ. Software direction solves extinction. China's distinct mental system solves econ concentration and nuclear security. The case page framing issues that they did not have an implication for any of these arguments. They weren't implicated as reasons that the app would fail at best. At best, they're mitigatory defense with no implication. At worst, they're just random arguments with no implication at all. But I'll answer them anyway. Every argument is about enforcement. Our argument is that the international perception shift that the plan would create solves their argument. They conceded the internal link to solving software. They conceded that the plan is able to boost consumer spending and wage gap, which increases China's software. Because the only reason it's low in the status quo is because the economy is tanked. Chinese software shift means that they do not have the potential to just say, no, we're not going to give you guys control over anything at all, because they have sort of adopted a new international perception of software, which means that they're no longer authoritarian, which solves everything that they've implicated independently of that those unions do not need control. They just need to be able to threaten the government. There is zero justification in the 2R as to why it takes out the affirmative, which means that you should air affirmative. All unions need to do is be able to threaten the government, because at that point the government will increase wages because they realize that workers are not working for them. They don't have replacement workers, which means that there's just zero justification for why it takes out the affirmative, which means 100% risk of a soft power scenario, at worst a very high one. Get that. The case outweighs the dissent. Creating better international global government systems is better able to solve every scenario that they've isolated. That sort of internal link to the internal link and impact perception of the dissent is created because of Chinese authoritarianism. It's what scares the United States into things like decoupling, because they realize that they don't have trust with Chinese economic exports, which is what leads to war in the status quo. The plan is able to shift Chinese international perception to soft power and incentivizes states to collaborate with one another, which solves the impact scenario to war. It doesn't necessarily need to mean that countries are more likely to engage in economic exports with them, but it does also mean that because countries would realize that China has the potential to boost their economy. Independent of that, though, if we win a soft power scenario, the interlink to solving the soft power was boosting the economy, which means if we win the case page in which they just drop that we do boost the economy, then it means that we solve the interlink to the dissent, because China is a more attractive and appeasing foreign investor, foreign country, which is an argument that we made on the dissent that was just not answered by them. The next thing I'll go for is defense of the dissent. They do not have any evidence on the link debate that says that the United States and China would decouple in the world of the plan. The only argument that they extended was that it talks about foreign countries. Yes, that might be true, but you dropped an argument that the United States and China are reliant on each other. I want you to look through your 2-hour flow and look to where they were able to point an alternative to China for the United States, or vice versa. The United States needs China for exporting. China needs the United States for Huawei 5G technology, which proves that there's just no potential for them to shift to anything else, and they have zero justification for why that would lead to war. At worst, it might make China less attractive for other countries, but because of the plan is able to boost China's economy, it means that other countries would still be investing. They have zero justification for why that applies. Turns to dissent, it might be a slower scenario, but it solves the conditions for war. This increases international protection, which makes war less.
I need to go to the bathroom.
Give me the orange piece.
Okay.
Recording actually works.